It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Prague and in the Czech Republic. I'm stunned at how beautiful this city is. I wanted to talk, I'm a writer, I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for 25 years. I currently write a column for the New York Times, but we've also created with a bunch of other journalists this project called the Solutions Journalism Network. And the main thing is to deal with a big problem in the world, which is the perception of reality that the news provides and how debilitating this is to our souls. This is really what the world looks like on a daily basis for many people if you're tuned in. And my experience was very different. I spent a lot of time reporting on social entrepreneurs and social innovators, but about 15 years. And my head is filled with solutions. I see remarkable things being born across the planet. So this is the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, which pioneered microfinance and has given billions of dollars of loans. It's not perfect by any means, but it's a very valuable contribution. I've been in India. This is a program founded by an Ashoka Fellow, where a national child protection system was created that's still largely operated by street children themselves, who rescue one another and connect them to services. The national system in India, the government has adopted this as the national child protection system. I was in South Africa during the height of the AIDS crisis, where a nurse, a retired nurse, who was also an Ashoka Fellow, used her entire $8,000 retirement savings to create a program to provide palliative care for people who had no medications, basically. And the youth in the community were the ones providing humanitarian care in the homes. This whole network is now being used and was adopted by the South African government as a national model to now help with orphans and also with elder care. This was in Hungary, where a mother of a disabled son created a new, much more normalized systems to help to create opportunities and a normalized life for people with disabilities. So all of these stories are in my head, and you can multiply by 1,000, and then we have the image of the world that looks like this. Journalism is all about problems, and every once in a while, usually on a Friday afternoon, they will give you a solution. And this is what people feel like when they watch the news, and it affects the way we vote. So the most predictive factor of whether somebody in the United States voted for Donald Trump was whether or not they answered yes to the question, people like me have no say. In other words, if they felt powerless, they were 86% more likely to vote for Donald Trump. It was more predictive than their age, their income, their gender, their attitudes towards Muslims, their attitudes towards Mexican immigrants. Sense of powerlessness was the thing that defined, in some sense, the election. And the powerlessness is directly related to the news because it washes over people. Now, the interesting thing is that if you survey young people and you ask them, what would you like from the news, the number one request is more journalism about solutions. The BBC has done this, the New York Times has done this, many news organizations have done this, and it's always the same response. Young people want information that helps them to build a better world. So sometimes the news tries to do this, but it does it often in a very light and fluffy way. So CNN Heroes is not considered serious news, it's considered entertainment. And it does not air every day, it airs on Thanksgiving. It's considered part of the make you feel good before Christmas news, which is not really serious. So the purpose of the network was to reframe solutions as serious news. And so the network was started by a bunch of journalists, and over the last 4 years we have worked with about 100 news organizations, including the BBC, all the way down to the New York Times, the Seattle Times, National Public Radio, and we're just starting now in India and Africa and in Europe. And the results have been pretty dramatic. This is the BBC's Solutions Journalism Toolkit that they created. We have a network now of journalists around the world, more than 2,000, who have joined this network in a commitment to change journalism and make it much more And these are hard solution stories. These are not advocacy. It's not stories to tell you to go out and do things. It's serious journalism that is done with rigor about how people are responding to problems and what we can learn from their results. So I just want to give a few examples of what I mean. This is a map of Cleveland, Ohio, which has a very poor stretch of the city. And the red areas in this map are the areas of lead paint exposure to children. And in some areas of the city, you can see that almost 50% of the children have been exposed to lead paint, which is a public health catastrophe. So the newspaper has tried to expose this problem many times, and they've never had much success with reform. So we worked with them, and we said, you can't just be a watchdog, you also have to be a guide dog. So a guide dog helps people find their way. And the journalists adopted this approach, and they went around, they showed the problem with a very, very heavy investigative piece, but they also started looking at other cities that had actually reduced lead paint exposure. And specifically, they looked at the how-tos. How did they do it? And then they compared Cleveland with other cities, and this combination of accountability and learning about solutions that other people created a much more powerful news product, and it led to 2 people being fired from the health department, which was important because they should have been fired. But it also led to new people being hired and new processes for doing the kind of audits that other cities had done. And now the paper is keeping the pressure on for making sure that these changes actually happen. But it doesn't make people feel apathetic because they know that there are actually things that they can do that work. But the key is to now combine the solutions with the accountability to create real change. So here's one of the stories that Cleveland did. They sent a journalist to Rochester, which is another city, and they said, how did Rochester reduce their lead paint? So it's this idea of learning from other places. It's journalism for learning rather than just accountability. Once we started working with news organizations in the United States, we found everybody started doing this. So this is a story that the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, one of the best newspapers in the country, they've won a lot of Pulitzer Prizes, they wanted to understand how to improve the way police treat people with mental illnesses. And they found that the best, or one of the better responses was in Houston, Texas. So they sent their reporter to Houston to learn from Houston and then to come back and bring that knowledge back to Milwaukee. And this led to a major reform, this series that they did, led to a major reform of police and a whole new system to improve the responses to mental health. This was a project that we helped sort of create the framework around that 70 news organizations in San Francisco all got together for one day to report on solutions or potential solutions to homelessness. San Francisco has one of the biggest homeless problems in the United States. And it produced more policy ideas in one day than years of coverage, of traditional coverage, had produced previous to this. In Minnesota, and this relates to your work, Adit, they have a large Somali community, and it's actually the #1 recruiting community for ISIS in the United States, and it has created great racial tensions. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune asked us to work on how can we do solutions-oriented journalism to look at what works to reduce radicalization. And so they started looking at what's happening within the Somali community, but they also started looking around the world. And they actually found that there were some really interesting models in Denmark. So they sent their journalists to Denmark to see how are they dealing with a similar problem there to bring back the knowledge to Minneapolis. So now you can begin to imagine a global learning system that journalism helps to feed into, where people are exchanging knowledge, not just reports about who blew something up today. We've seen this in Seattle, and I just want to show a couple of examples of the impact that this is having, both at the local level and on the newspaper itself. One of our best partners is the Seattle Times. Very good newspaper. They have won 9 Pulitzer Prizes, so they're known for very hard-hitting investigative journalism. They did an expose on showing that the black children in the Seattle public schools were being suspended at more than 5 times the rate as the white children. So then they had graphs and data, and this created outrage in the city when they were shown. And so they knew that this would cause a lot of uproar, but they wanted to also give people ideas about what could be done about this. So they started doing stories about schools that had actually found better ways of responding to suspensions. So in many cases, schools use something that's called restorative justice, where they actually teach children about their behavior rather than just throwing them out of the school. And these approaches actually prove quite successful when they're done well. They reduce suspension rates, and what happened with this is it not only, I'm going to go back for a second, the project not only got the city of Seattle to ban suspensions of children, so you can no longer suspend children in elementary school in Seattle. So this is a good policy change, which was one of the goals. But at the same time, schools have also started to look at these alternative practices and learn from other schools about what's a better way to deal with suspensions than just hitting kids over the head with baseball bats. The people reading these stories have told the paper, this is really good. And what they have found is that the page views are double. They've gone up 100%. The time that people spend with the articles has gone up 80%. And the amount that these articles get shared is up 230%. These are very important metrics for the news business, for revenues, for business. So this is really what gets the interest of publishers, these kinds of things, because they correlate with advertising revenues and sponsorships. This was pretty exciting for us. One of our projects, a poverty puzzle in a city called Chattanooga, Tennessee, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So it's the first time that a Pulitzer, they didn't win it, was a finalist for the Pulitzer was a solutions-oriented piece. It's the first time ever, to my knowledge, that this has happened. So we're beginning to think maybe we're getting somewhere. So finally, just to conclude, the network is now comprised of a few thousand journalists. We are pulling all the stories together as quickly as we can, and we have thousands of stories that look at how different communities are dealing with refugees, with homelessness, with poverty, with global warming, and so forth. And this map, this database, is kind of like a real-time view of the human creative impulse to fix the world. And you could never see this if you watched CNN 24 hours a day for 50 years. You would have no clue that there are so many creative ideas being born today, and that we live in a world of profound creativity when it comes to social problem solving. And this is a very, very important part, I think, of human education, of how children should be able to see the world so that they feel powerful. They will not vote for someone who just wants to destroy things. They actually think of building things. And so we're very much hoping that this grows. And one of my goals, and I'm very grateful for coming here, is to be able to have contact with journalists in Czech and in Austria in order to see if this idea is of interest to people here. We're very interested in supporting people. So thank you very much for inviting me here, and really appreciate your time. Thank you. Give me water. Okay. Oh, thank you.